We begin this hour with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov acknowledging Russia has sustained, quote, significant losses of troops in Ukraine, and he called it a huge tragedy for Russia. It's an unusual acceptance of Russian officials on the current situation. But Peskov still says that Russia hopes to reach its military goals in the coming days. The country's defense ministry reports that between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, but independent estimates put the number closer to 10,000. Our next guest is Stephanie Babst. She's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Ms. Babst, welcome to DW. Thank you for being with us. I want to start by asking you to your reaction to what the spokesperson there has said.
Well, I guess the Russian leadership doesn't have much choice other than admitting that it has really suffered losses, much more significant losses, in fact. But I guess it's part of the overall gameplay of the Kremlin to prepare the ground for a longer-term war in Ukraine.
Now, meanwhile, NATO foreign ministers have been meeting in Brussels. The Ukrainian foreign minister was also there, and Dmytro Kuleba says he needs three things: weapons, weapons, weapons. That was all that was on the agenda, and he wants them quickly. It's not exactly clear what NATO has been providing. Has there been any kind of shift in the type of weapons that the alliance has been sending Ukraine from day one to now?
For one, NATO as an organization has not provided any weapons. You know, it's the allies, it's the 30 member countries that provide weapons and military equipment, and NATO doesn't even have a coordinating role. So what the Secretary General has actually asked for is for the allies to consider providing more of the heavy military equipment that is really needed to counter a massive land offensive. And I think this is what we are talking about in the days and weeks to come, as Russia has started to regroup and reinforce its military troops in the Donbass and south of Ukraine.
We heard from the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg a short while ago. Let's have a quick listen to what he had to say.
Allies have been doing a lot and are determined to do more, now and for the medium and longer term, to help the brave Ukrainians defend their homes and their country and push back the invading forces. Allies are also supporting and stepping up humanitarian aid and financial support. We discussed what more we will do, including cyber security assistance and providing equipment to help Ukraine protect against chemical and biological threats.
Now, he mentioned chemical and biological threats. If there were to be that type of an attack on Ukraine, would NATO's position change in any way? Is that the red line for NATO? Is there a red line for NATO?
Well, it's, I personally think, very wise of the allies not to identify any red lines in advance. I mean, we used to have had stories in the past where red lines were marked and then nothing really happened. So we want to avoid this time. But at the same time, it's very important to do what we call a NATO contingency planning, to prepare for worst-case scenarios, to prepare for what-if scenarios. And I think this is what the allies have started to do already with regard to chemical weapons that Russia eventually may use, but also for a potential eventual application or deployment, rather, of tactical nukes.
We hear quite a bit about not provoking Vladimir Putin. NATO, Western allies have repeatedly said we can't do anything that might make this situation worse or that this would spill over into NATO territory. But it's become very clear that the criteria for what is considered provocation is very different in Moscow than it is in the West. So why are the countries that are part of the alliance comfortable with supplying weapons to Ukraine but not doing much more?
Well, I think it's indeed very, very important to consider the potential consequences of any action. And this is what the allies are doing collectively. And they have collectively decided, personally, I think wisely so, to not push it too hard, to not give Putin that much of a potential excuse to say, see, I told you so. NATO is entering a war zone. NATO is becoming an active member, and a party of this operation in Ukraine. So let's go for it. In order to avoid that, they have kept this defensive line. However, personally, I believe it's very, very wise not to always look at what Mr. Putin has in mind, but to really focus on the way we define our own strategies and policy goals in support of Ukraine.
In terms of NATO expansion, Putin has repeatedly said that this is something that has aggravated him. But this war on Ukraine has actually pushed some countries to consider NATO membership when perhaps they wouldn't have. We're talking about Finland and Sweden.
Right. I personally believe that we're going to see a formal application of Finland, most likely also Sweden, anytime soon. I'm not talking, of course, days, but rather weeks. But I think it's remarkable how these two countries have changed their minds, both in terms of public opinion, but also parliamentary support for NATO membership. In many ways, it's a logical step that these countries would take if they put an application form filled out on the table, because they have been partners of NATO for so long, very valuable partners. They have provided first-class support for NATO operations. They participated in exercises. And indeed, they would really, really be first-class assets if admitted by the allies.
Stephanie Babst, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, thank you very much for being with us and your insights.
Yeah, you're most welcome.